about. Obviously, we're quite prominent in County Durham. Selective licensing is the major licensing scheme here that affects 29,000 homes. There is also HMO licensing and additional licensing. Additional licensing, probably in the northeast less so, but they tend to deal with smaller HMOs, which is 3 or more non-related occupants in a property. So if there was 3 adults who were completely unrelated, who chose to share a terraced house, it becomes a small HMO, and some councils have additional licensing. It isn't particularly prevalent locally, which I think is probably a statement of local demographics and housing styles. Newcastle city centre, perhaps a bit more of a sharers market. In Durham, not so much so. But certainly if you have an HMO, which is normally 5 or more households, 5 or more people making up 2 or more households, that would normally be mandatory licensing. But really tonight I'll focus on the selective licensing, because this has been such a real issue in Durham. 29,000 homes that became licensable last year, usually in low demand and low rent areas. The logic from the council was that these were problem properties and problem areas, and licensing was a mechanism to try and move those areas forward and to get them into a better position. We actually did a webinar last year. It will be slightly out of date because we were talking about the scheme being implemented, but if anybody's facing licensing, if you drop us a message, we still have the recording, because much of the content is actually still valid. Really, the scheme is as was. So if anybody is applying for a license, isn't sure if they need a license, give us a shout. We can send the link for that webinar. It was a whole session on Durham's selective licensing scheme. It probably included a lot of my opinions on the scheme that probably all still hold true, actually. So if anyone's interested, actually, if you let us know, we could email that link. I won't go over all that material this evening because it's a whole rant in itself that I won't bore everyone with. But it became effective in April 2022 and runs for 5 years. It was actually 42% of Durham's private rented homes that required a license. So a vast scheme. I would say some good and some bad things about it, but a vast scheme. We required hundreds of licenses that we've applied for clients. So a major undertaking. I think the general message is, if you're not sure if you need one, have one, or are complying, give us a shout, because it's particularly important. And I will come to a fine that's been levied that is quite scary, actually. I have it in the slides, but there has been a landlord fine that is quite eye-watering. I'll come back to that. But in effect, selective licensing was intended to be a mechanism to deal with low demand, antisocial behaviour and deprivation in specific postcode areas around County Durham. I don't think any of us would argue with the fact that those issues exist. I don't necessarily think that this alone was the right mechanism to resolve them. But like many bits of legislation, it's here, it exists. Whether I agree or not, we have to comply, and we do comply. It does have some positives. If I drag them out, it does have some, but many challenges. But the crux of it is, if you have a let property in County Durham and the postcode is in a licensable area, that is something we can check for you. There's a postcode checker. It is postcode by postcode. But if your postcode is eligible, owners must have a license to let a property. And if the landlord doesn't, there are penalties, civil penalties up to £30,000. Councils can put in place a management order where, in effect, they say you're not fit as a landlord, we're going to take over your property and we're going to manage it for you. Or they might appoint an agent, but it in effect takes control away from you entirely. There is the potential for rent repayment orders, which I'm going to come on to a little bit later. Again, touch wood, I'm pleased to say, not something AMRP's experienced, but they do exist, and tenants are becoming increasingly aware of them. And the other, to circle some of the things we've talked about, if this licence wasn't in place, there's an inability to gain possession under the Section 21 that we mentioned. So you're probably starting to see that a lot of these issues sort of circle around each other and are very interlinked. I can understand that for private landlords tackling this under their own steam, it's probably quite scary, but there's a huge spider's web of these things pulling together. in terms of ability to gain possession, and it all starts at tenancy commencement. So the last update we had from Durham Council, who do issue updates, was that they'd revoked one licence from a licence holder, presumably because they'd done something we'll call naughty. So one licence holder had had their licence taken away. I'd probably like to see that number being bigger. You know, as an agent who desperately works very hard, sometimes when we don't agree, but we work very hard to be compliant and to do what we need to. So for me, I'd like to see more licences being revoked, because actually if those landlords were removed from the market, it would assist tenants and it would improve areas. But I appreciate it's early in the 5 years. They were saying, this was an update some months back, and they were saying they'd revoked one licence. So they found one landlord who they didn't feel was fit or proper to manage the tenancy. And they've obviously been taken out of the private rented sector, which I think is a good thing. Hopefully there'll be more. The big one, this was quite recent. It made the press. A Durham landlord had been ordered to pay £47,000, having been prosecuted. They actually had 8 tenanted properties that were in Hordern and Blackhall in the east of County Durham. That is actually an area that very much needs selective licensing, quite troubled, quite low demand. We do manage properties there, but they're difficult. So the landlord had 8 properties. It was also found that upon presentation, he or the landlord had an electrical inspection certificate where the electrician didn't have the appropriate registrations to undertake that work. So the document was in effect invalid. So in effect, this gentleman was fined £47,000 for having 8 tenanted properties without a licence. He had failed to respond to all of the engagement with Durham to move forward. So a combination of lack of licence and the invalid EICR, which is the electrical inspection report, cost this landlord £47,000, which is will be more than one of the properties is worth, because a terrace in Hordern, unfortunately, wouldn't make £47,000. So a huge fine. Personally, we welcome it. You know, the purpose of this scheme was to find and deal with landlords who aren't compliant, aren't looking after tenants, aren't looking after the properties, and are probably bringing community problems. So this is absolutely eye-watering, but actually I quite welcome this, and I'm heartened to see that Durham are getting to the point where they're taking action. They are finding the people that shouldn't be in the private rented sector or who aren't equipped to be. And clearly they're starting to get to grips with them. So I hope, that there will be more. Durham do give an opportunity before it gets this far for someone to engage. A landlord could engage an agent. There's a million things that a well-meaning landlord could do if they're genuinely innocent, to avoid the fine of this level. But I'd suspect this person has chosen not to engage and sort of flouted any engagement. So if you watch my webinar from last year, I was talking a lot about the fact that I hoped this would happen. I knew they would put a lot of time and burden on myself and team in terms of us demonstrating that we're compliant, and they absolutely have. But it is nice to see that not only are they pestering us, but they are finding some people, that genuinely aren't acting as they should. So it is happening. So if there's any doubt in your mind about licences, I think either reach out or you want to go to Durham directly, but certainly we could assist. I do have the webinar from last year that I can send the link for if anyone wanted. It was about 40 minutes, I think, as background and context that might be helpful. So if anyone wanted that, let Neil know on the chat and we'll send you the link. But it's just to be aware, it's very real now. If Durham are finding someone £47,000, it's something that you need to be aware of and confident you have in order. So that is Durham selective licensing. Rent repayment. Well, obviously we're quite prominent in County Durham. Selective licensing is the major licensing scheme here that affects 29,000 homes. There is also HMO licensing and additional licensing.